It's so lovely to be here. I've known Lucy for quite a long time, and obviously been a great fan. And one of my tickle buttons was the programme, I don't know if any of you remember, it was quite a long time ago, when the BBC did a series about how St Paul's worked whilst she was there as originally a minor canon. And it was just so utterly horrific how she was treated that it sort of upped my radar about how women are treated in the church quite considerably. And she has just managed it with the most enormous grace and growing self-confidence, and of course is a significant voice into the country nowadays. So it's really fabulous to be here, and I even got a nice little note from her saying she was sorry she couldn't be here, but she's doing something else ever so important somewhere. So isn't it bizarre? Is nationalism the new religion? Gets an extra twist, doesn't it, after Manchester, and how we feel about our country and how we respond and how we see some people as insiders and some people as outsiders. And I think eventually, when you strip away all the arguments, you're talking about the use of power in communities, both in religion and in nationalism, and you're talking about imagination. What is it that gets under your skin and takes you from the pedestrian everyday way in which you live to create something where you're connected with other people and your imagination takes hold and it causes you to act, to behave in all sorts of different ways, for better and for worse? So let's start with this. This morning I said, as I was leading the communion service, our Lord Jesus Christ said, the first commandment is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the only Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbour as yourself. There is no greater commandment than this. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And the response was, okay, so who is my neighbour? And of course Jesus went on to tell this amazing story, which we're all so comfortable with and know it and think we know what it's all about the Good Samaritan. And that story crosses just about every possible boundary that there is. It confuses who's an insider and who's an outsider, who's a real Jew, who isn't a Jew, who's rich, who's poor, who's religious, who's not religious. It messes with all the boundaries, and then Jesus says, so you work out, who is your neighbour? How are you going to behave? And of course it was a highly important question in those days. You remember that Israel was occupied, it was Roman occupation, they were fighting for their own identity. This whole thing, which we think is relatively recent, and in many ways it is, of a nation state and of nationalism, was really important. They thought he'd come to be their great hero and set them free as a nation. They saw him primarily as a political figure, almost more than a religious figure. And he was messing with all that and saying, actually, the way of Christ is nothing like what you think. It's not to do with heroic leadership, it's not to do with nationalism, it's to do with loving the most unlikely people as much as you love yourself. Did you hear there was a very, very challenging guy on Radio 4 earlier this week, it might even have been a thought for the day, where he said, you know, when we say the Lord's Prayer and we say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And this guy was saying, so does that really mean, please God, forgive us our middle-class, parochial, self-centred, self-obsessed little peccadillos? Or does it mean, forgive us so that we forgive other people their gross, gratuitous, enormous, horrible sins, like the one that we've just seen in Manchester? When we pray, do we realise the depth of the challenge of saying, forgive us as we forgive others? So I thought we'd try and start off by just teasing out some of the potential dangerous similarities between bad religion and the dangerous part of nationalism, and maybe some of the similarities between good religion and patriotism. There may be some good to be found here as well. So how about if religion, and I think I'm talking about religion and organised religion a little bit more than I'm talking about individualised internal faith, but how about religion gives us a corporate language with which to articulate the really deep stuff? I'm a great advocate for teaching philosophy in schools, because we do not give our children a language to talk about non-concrete concepts. But religion does give us that language through symbol, through ritual, as well as through language and through music. It gives us a language to talk about the really deep stuff. So I take an extraordinary number of funerals, and they're nearly all for people who basically wouldn't particularly come to church, but when it comes to it and there's really deep stuff going on, they want religion to mediate in order to articulate something deep that they otherwise don't have language for, and they want to do it together with other people. They don't just want to do it on their own. Very, very occasionally I have someone who says, nah, I don't want a funeral. But the rest of their family and their relations are devastated because there is a task to be done as human beings together, and religion fills that space very well indeed. It's bigger than an individual. Religion, of course, may or may not involve God. We think of our own Christian religion and we think, yes, I've just spoken to you about the Lord our God is the only Lord, but there are other religions that do multiple gods or don't really articulate God at all. But that act of articulating deep stuff is still what's going on. Then, of course, inevitably it shapes part of your identity. I don't know if you listened to Elif Shafak this afternoon on Desert Island Discs. She's the most wonderful Turkish poet. Fantastic woman. That's right, yes. She is wonderful. I was on a panel at the Festival Hall with her recently, and she's a wonderful woman. And she was talking about how in this day and age we have to construct multiple identities. And it's to do with our language and our homeland and maybe our adopted land, and to do with our faith, all sorts, and to do with our educational experience and all sorts of things. We construct multiple identities, but quite easily and naturally people use their religion as part of their identity. I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian. Multiple identities, but religion is one real signifier of it. And of course that identity can be as dependent on who you exclude as who you include. There's the sort of true believer syndrome. You know, you meet someone from Scotland and they look at someone putting sugar on their porridge and say, no Scot would ever put sugar on their porridge. And someone stands up and says, oh, I'm a Scot and I put sugar on my porridge. And they say, no true Scot would ever put sugar on their porridge. They all have salt. And we have this, don't we, within religion, that not only do we define which group we belong to, but then we tighten it down. So there's the true believer and the really, really true believer. And we an incredible tendency, A, to define ourselves by who we exclude, and B, then to persecute minorities. So as you might expect, I would want to say that it is a very dark side of religion, that for most of the history of the Christian religion we have persecuted LGBTI people because they're a minority and they stand outside the mainstream, and it gives us a place to put some of the dark stuff that maybe is within us, and we dump it on them, and then we feel really good about ourselves. Religion tells stories. All religion tells very similar stories about creation, about how we live in community, about where we think we're going after death. They're actually all relatively similar stories that we tell one another. But there are two ways in which people go, especially in the 21st century. And one way is to take them very literally and think these stories are actually our history. And one way is to treat them as myth, which of course can bear a huge amount of truth, or as metaphor, which also can bear a huge amount of truth, but is not literal. The first way, I think, leads to imprisoning you within your own story, and the second way leads, I think, to the sort of freedom that Christ was pointing to in his own life when he came to bring us freedom, perfect freedom. And I think that's quite a big divide between good religion and bad religion. It has variable associations with tribal identity. If you take a global view, you can very quickly see that, for example, in this country, the different denominations within religion are also indicators of our class system. So it's been very, very commonly known that most bishops went to private schools. I mean, 80% of bishops historically have always gone to public schools. So it's an indicator of our hierarchical system that we're still locked into in this country. Methodism had a very strong sense of being working class, engaged, practical, for the people. And it took off with a big woomph at the same time as industrialisation and trade unions and all that kind of thing, when people were beginning to have a voice. If you look in Germany, for example, you've got the northern countries being Protestant, and as those little princedoms and so on began to join together and try and form a sense of nationhood, so the Protestantism was a really important part. And the southern parts of Germany are still kind of tribally Catholic. And interestingly, although there are very few people who are very fussed about their religion anymore in Germany, nevertheless, there's a sense of, I'm a cradle Catholic. I don't believe any of that stuff. And they say, that's just the Pope for you. They don't believe it exactly, but nevertheless, part of their tribal identity is that they're Catholic or they're Protestant in that country. And of course, then it gets worse. You talk about almost any civil war around the world, and there's a religious dynamic to it. Are you a Sunni or a Shia Muslim? Northern Ireland, Catholic or Protestant? The religion and the tribalism go hand in hand very easily. Religion can deepen your sense of social responsibility, but it can also give you a get out of jail free card. And I think that argument goes in this way: if you have a very literal understanding of what the Bible says, then you can have a real person in front of you who needs your compassion and your love and your support and your inclusion. And you can look at what the text says, and you can say, actually, although I know in many ways people would think I ought to be compassionate towards you, nevertheless, the text means I don't have to be. Because don't blame me, blame God for the way in which I behave. And I think, with due respect to our American friends here, I think that happens an awful lot in very strong Protestant evangelical environments, where they are at the moment, many of them still treating LGBTI people absolutely appallingly. And when you ask them, they say, of course we want to be nice to them, let's be much nicer to them, but we will continue to exclude them because that's what the Bible says.
You are not wrong.
It's sad, and it happens over here as well. Yes, please do, yes. Two more points as far as the nature of religion, and of course you contribute huge more. You tend to feel really good when you get together with like-minded people, which is lovely, and it makes you feel good, and it makes you feel part of something that's bigger than yourself, and it's a whole identity thing. But it also allows you to act in ways which you might not if you thought you as an individual were responsible for the way in which you behaved. So you think of how crowds behave, and then you think about the way in which actually a church can become a crowd, or a religion can become a crowd. Or you find your church doing stuff that you don't really believe in, but because your sense of belonging is so important to you, you go along with it instead of challenging it. So you behave in ways which you might not otherwise do because the religion is your clan. And finally, I'm just looking at the way in which the Church of England is developing in this country and as a state religion, and thinking about the move away from the Church of England being a folk religion. It is becoming higher and higher that the step that you have to take to be a real member of the Church of England seems to be getting higher and higher. So 30 or 40 years ago, it was absolutely fine. You knew there were some keen people who did church, and they did it all the time, and they kept the place going. But for most people, it was perfectly okay to say, yeah, I'm a Christian, and you go at Easter, and you go at Christmas, and you didn't think there was any conflict between that. No one said, oh, you're a real hypocrite. And then it got so that we expected you to turn up a little bit more. And now we've got to the point where you're expected to go on a few courses and do some discipleship and make sure that you really get your giving sorted out before God. So the threshold at which you become a true believer is getting higher and higher. So I think the way we're going is that you will have a church which has a much more intense core and is quite vibrant in and of itself. But that wonderful sort of you may or you may not, you can come, you can go, no one's going to judge you thing, which was, I think, the crown jewels of the Church of England, is really, really vulnerable. I went over to Denmark not so long ago and talked to them about the way in which it works in Denmark, and they still genuinely have that folk religion. 80% of people in Denmark still pay their religious taxes. So the churches are impeccable, you know, nothing's falling down. They have a very good choir, they pay their clergy properly, they do fantastic academic work in their universities. Pretty much everyone in Denmark still gets married in a church and baptised in a church and buried in a church, but they hardly ever go. But it still informs the way in which the country ticks. And the governing body of the church is their parliament. They are the same thing. So they still function as a folk religion, and it still sort of infiltrates the way in which thinking is done at both a religious and a sociological way in that country. And I think that used to be the way until after the war in this country. And since then, it has been gradually unwinding. So we'll see how it goes, but I think that there are vulnerabilities for the Church of England at the moment from that open, inclusive, liberal, come if you want to, we're not going to judge you if you don't, but you can come back again in 2 years' time kind of model that I rather rejoiced in. So let's just move on a little bit to nationalism and see if there are any parallels and whether nationalism could be viewed as a religion. I think I would like to make a plea for a difference between nationalism and patriotism. I think there is a way in which people can justifiably be patriotic if they really want to. I have a stronger sense of being European than I have a sense of being British, but that's because I had an English dad and a Swiss mum. And I think that most of us actually have a quite dispersed sense of origin if we really burrow down into it. Have you seen the wonderful Facebook or YouTube clip where they got a group of people to talk about how they felt about other nationalities? And they say, oh, but of course, you know, the gypsies, they really are the pits. And then you get an Indian person saying, well, of course, you know, it's very important to be pure Indian, because if I was Pakistani, they're just really not trustworthy. And then they send all these people off to have DNA tests. And of course, everyone is a bit of all these things, including the ones that they really hated. It's a wonderful clip. And I'm just wondering whether I'm brave enough to do that as part of my Lent course next year. It would be so cool. So I think even patriotism is a kind of difficult concept in the world of globalization. But if you put together your language and your cultural heritage and your art and your history and all that sort of thing, I think there is a claim for being justifiably attached to your homeland, whatever that might be. And of course, if I think of my mum, she went through these sort of waves of feeling either British or Swiss. And sometimes she'd feel terribly attached to Switzerland, even though she couldn't live there, and she'd see all the good things. And then at other times she'd think, I know why I came to England, because of this openness and this liberal way of doing things, and I really feel that I'm British. And I think there'll be more and more people who have these multiple identities. So I looked up the definition of nationalism, and it says an extreme form of patriotism marked by a feeling of superiority over other countries. So I guess patriotism sees your identity as your identity, but amongst many multiple other possible equal identities. And nationalism sees it in terms of superiority over other countries. And of course, in this country, we've got the whole big added thing of carrying with us this post-colonial stuff. So again, I looked it up. Did you know that there are only 22 countries in the whole world that have not either been invaded or occupied by this country? So we carry with us an enormous heritage of thinking that we're better than everyone else and that we're entitled to rule. And it's a big thing to get past, and you think you're free from it, but actually that long historic folk memory rattles down through the ages. And so we get the nonsense that we get when people stand up and say, well, our National Health Service is the best health service in the world. No, it's not. Our education system, we pour money into our education system. It's the most wonderful education system in the world. No, it's not. It's something like 65th in the world. Reality check. So I think both nationalism and, in fact, religion tell stories that are only marginally attached to the truth, but they're very important in terms of sustaining their own ecosystem. So nationalism will tell all sorts of stories, as of course we saw in Brexit, which are not necessarily related to the truth, but actually stir people up and give them something to coalesce around. Nationalism is clear. In an age when so many things are not certain, you can put a post in the ground and say, this is who I am, this is where I am, and I love this country. So it's something that is very clear and very clear-cut, and you can stand up and say it, and it feels secure. It also shapes identity in a way which is not necessarily political. Again, it has a tendency to persecute minorities, a very strong tendency to persecute minorities, but not necessarily. The English Defence League, would you believe it, has a gay subset. There are gay English Defence League people. Now, you think that wouldn't go together, but it does. And yes, it tells this story about England still being the greatest. Did you know that in Europe, these are the countries that were not conquered or occupied at some stage or invaded? Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Andorra, Monaco, the Vatican City, and then Sweden and Belarus. The whole of the rest of Europe has it sometimes. So when we get up at the European Parliament and stamp our foot and say, we are not standing for any nonsense from you lot, just imagine how they feel, given what the history is and the way in which historically we have treated them. Nowadays, nationalism has to be built on self-identification because we have become so mixed racially. But it's still the myth. The figures are becoming vanishingly small that this is a Christian country. But on Any Questions yesterday, someone said very strongly, we are still a Christian country. That is the reality. And there was massive applause. So there's something still about religion, religious history, and the sense of being British that people see, even though they wouldn't self-identify as Christians at an individual level. And of course, you could link the monarchy into that. The monarchy does ritual religion, and I'm sure the Queen does personal religion at a very, very high level. Nobody goes to church for years and years and years, but they all put the telly on when it's a royal wedding. Tricky question for a nationalist: where is your first duty of care? Mostly they believe that charity should go to the British needy. And there's that awful philosophical example, isn't there, which you can extend to nationalism. Two children fall into the water and you can only save one. They're both drowning. Do you save the British one or the foreign one? Wonder what nationalism would answer to that. And again, like religion, you feel good when you get together with like-minded people, and you might act in ways that you would not if you were alone. So, to conclude, I think nationalism and religion in some ways are inevitable bedfellows on the world stage. In UK, Brexit, in an essentially secular society, provided some sort of a larger narrative that in the end the majority, admittedly a small majority of people, actually bought into as if it were a religion. And they sat very lightly to the truth. Truth be told, both sides didn't do too well on the truth stakes. But the identity thing became so strong that even people who knew they were voting for stuff that would damage their lives quite considerably, nevertheless felt that they were British and that is what they had to do. This is who I am, this is what I believe in. Here are all the people who are like me, and together maybe we can change things in a way that I on my own could never do. So, as Christians, we claim that we are all equal in the sight of God. As Christians, we have a special duty of welcome to the stranger and the refugee, which of course Jesus himself was. So I've got a very simple question to end with. Can you actually be both deeply Christian and a nationalist? Thank you.